Good evening, and welcome to CITI Media Reporter. I'm Howard Homanoff. Our guest this evening is David Claytell, Professor of Professional Practice and Chair of International Studies at Columbia Journalism School. David, thank you for joining us.
Great pleasure.
So let me dive in with a really simple, easy question. What's the state of journalism today? You can start from where you want to. How should we think about journalism today?
Well, the state of journalism varies dramatically from place to place and medium to medium. It's no secret that in North America and Western Europe, a lot of the legacy news organizations are struggling. Their business model hasn't been sustainable. The advertising community has not yet shifted sufficient resources into their digital products to replace the losses in print or television advertising. In other parts of the world, exactly the opposite is the case. Large growing economies, Brazil, India, China, others, where literacy rates are rising, distribution of electronic signals, whether it's cable or broadband or wireless, is rapidly increasing. The advertising economy is rising dramatically because these are becoming consumer societies. So in those places, journalism, at least as a business, is on the rise. There are, of course, major problems with censorship and government control of content, but as a business, no one's worried about that in a lot of the second and third world countries. The second thing is that journalism faces a real challenge of definition because 10 years ago, we could all define what was the difference between a professional journalist and everybody else. And what did a professional journalist do that other people didn't do? That distinction is pretty well evaporated. You have ubiquitous cell phones. Everyone can be a publisher. Everyone can be a photographer or videographer. Everybody can connect to social media. Everybody can be on Twitter and so forth and so on. So the whole notion of journalism, one way you could define it is the actual process of making the content, writing, shooting, editing, so forth. That's now widely available to the public. The second way you might define it is publishing, whether on TV or cable or newspapers or magazines. That too is widely available to everybody above the age of about 8. So it's a real challenge of definition. And because it's a challenge of definition, a lot of journalists and journalism organizations are desperately trying to redefine themselves to greater or lesser success, and sometimes with much less clarity in what it is they actually wish to become in this new ecosystem than you might think.
So let's kind of break it down and maybe start with television. And the, kind of most, in terms of television journalism, the sort of, earthquake of recent times is Brian Williams. And maybe the bigger story of your interest is, and mine, is not necessarily specifically what Brian Williams did or didn't do, but the role of the anchor and what, kind of, why is it still so important? Is that justified? Why are, does it make sense that we're as focused on the Brian Williams story, I'll say the collective royal, are as focused on that story as we have been?
Well, the Brian Williams story, and there are others out there of sort of famous flameouts of prominent people in television news, is actually emblematic of a much, much deeper trend. Brian Williams is a symptom of the larger set of issues. And in my view, it goes something like this. For many, many years, from post-World War II until the mid-1990s, network television news was never intended to be profitable. Some of what it did was profitable. Most obviously 60 Minutes, which remains a cash cow for CBS, but interestingly enough, is not part of CBS News. 60 Minutes is its own division of the company, and the Today Show. Right? On the other hand, local television news in stations in markets all around the country, in fact, has been profitable for 30 years, extremely profitable for most stations. It is one of the largest sources of income for the typical local station. How did they do that? Well, they did it in part by local coverage, but largely because they have huge sports and weather segments in their newscast, because their anchors and reporters become real celebrities in the towns and cities where the stations are located, because the news department and the news program is essentially the only thing those stations produce themselves. Everything else they would buy from a network or from a syndication company. Well, we all used to sneer at that. In the late 90s, when ownership began to change at the networks, when networks were sold or merged, so NBC became NBC Universal, ABC was first bought by Capital Cities and then by Disney and so forth. Those companies, which did not come out of a journalism background, looked at what local stations were achieving and how news, in fact, could be profitable. They bought the networks and then I guess sort of said, wow, wait a minute, why are we doing this at a loss as a sort of a public service? We could do a version of this, it'll still be pretty good, and make a lot of money. So they actually started to not quite imitate what local stations did, but draw examples from it. So network news became longer, as local stations had gone from a half hour to an hour to an hour and a half to 2 hours in a market like New York or Los Angeles or Chicago. The Today Show went from an hour and a half to 3 hours to all morning, is what it does now. And they said, what else makes local news profitable? Well, the anchor people and the reporters are beloved personalities. They go to charity events. They play on the softball team for the company. They're not it's not Walter Cronkite emerging once a day to tell us about the world. So the Brian Williams is an example of that trend, of the anchor person, not so much as the voice of authority, but the anchor person as friend, as somebody you'd like to live near.
A corporate ambassador.
A corporate ambassador, good guy, all that kind of stuff. No grumpiness permitted.
Right.
Now, in his particular situation, he took that to a whole new level. He would appear on 30 Rock, he would appear on Saturday Night Live, sometimes doing comedic send-ups of himself and the news division.
Right.
But this didn't come out of nowhere. As I say, the networks kind of imported this kind of approach from the local stations. And of course, the news became profitable on the networks. Once it became profitable on the networks, then they were really afraid to lose any of that income. When they weren't making income, not such a big problem. When they were, and the new ownership wanted to maintain those profits, it really changed the tenor and tone of network news. And I don't think we're at the end of that process yet. It's a much more overtly commercial enterprise than it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago.
I want to pick up on your you mentioned of local news and local broadcasting, and I want to maybe give viewers here a little history lesson in the midst of this too, which is that we happen to share long, deep ties to Boston, and part of your background is with WCVB in Boston, which for people who don't know, sort of has a almost a hagiographic reputation amongst media observers. Talk a bit about what WCVB was, why it sort of stood out, and is that does that no longer, is there nothing like that today? And if not, why not?
Well, WCVB, which is now an ABC affiliate and has been for a long time, reflects its really unusual parentage. In the first place, the company itself, the parent company, which was called in those days, in the 1960s and early 70s, called Boston Broadcasters Incorporated, had on its board a lot of non-traditional people, Harvard professors, doctors, academics, investors, not just corporate executives.
And with local, strong local roots.
Strong local roots.
Yeah.
The other thing is, the station is the result of a more than 24-year legal battle in Boston when television was, when the Federal Communications Commission authorized TV stations in Boston in the early 50s. They gave one channel to the Archdiocese of Boston, not surprisingly. They gave one channel.
They always had a lot of scratch in that market, yeah.
The Boston Globe was affiliated with a channel, and one channel ended up in the ownership of what was then called the Herald Traveler. It was the big newspaper that competed with the Boston Globe. The board of Boston Broadcasters Incorporated protested and then filed suit. And they said, the process by which you awarded these franchises wasn't fair, and in our particular case, you shouldn't have given the license to the Herald Traveler because one of the chairman of the board had lunch with one of the FCC commissioners. And it turned out he had. And in fact, a book was later written about it called The $20 Million Lunch. But the attorneys for Boston Broadcasters pursued this suit for more than 24 years through state courts, through the Federal Communications Commission. It went up and down to the U.S. Supreme Court twice. Right? Finally, in 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court said, we're not going to review it anymore. We're going to take the license away from the Herald Traveler, which had operated it, and by the way, kept all the money from 24 years of operation, and we're going to give it to Boston Broadcaster. One of the outcomes of that is they got the station through a regulatory and legal process, was they sort of wanted to prove they were the best people on the block. And they promised the FCC as an inducement to take the license away from the Herald Traveler, that if you give us the license, we'll do children's programming. I produced some of it. We'll do public affairs programming, serious, locally produced public affairs programming, 6 nights a week. We'll do longer newscasts. We'll do all this important community-based stuff, whether it makes us money or not. So they get the license. Now they're stuck with their promises. So from the beginning, it was conceived as a sort of highly commercial public service organization, and it has retained some of that flavor ever since. It's been sold several times. It's now owned by Hearst, but through it all, CVB has had this aura of the kind of slightly dull, slightly serious, earnest public service commercial station.
And is there still an opportunity for, not necessarily on quite as grand a scale or with quite as lofty maybe a promise, but is there still kind of more opportunity for local broadcast stations to reverse what we've seen as the trend, in a sense, of being, almost all nationally syndicated television, or is it simply the era that has passed?
Rather sadly, I think it's the era that has passed. First of all, there's almost no one watching television today that hasn't for 30 years been conditioned to expect the sort of eyewitness news, heavy personality, heavy sports and weather, lots of drama and accidents and
Fuzz and was.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you'd have to unwind the expectations of an awful lot of the viewers. The second thing is that doing is purely economic. Doing serious content for broadcast is really expensive. It takes a lot of people. It takes excellent facilities. The aesthetics of it are, it's much more on the model of PBS or here in New York, WNET, but they're supported by donations and other things. If you're trying to do that and be not just profitable, but as profitable as you were doing the junky stuff, I think that day has passed. The other thing is, with the ubiquity of information that's available to the public in their pockets on cell phones, on their tablets, on their desktops, through social media and 100 other ways, the demand to get that information from a broadcast company is dropped a lot.
Right.
Younger viewers might demand it, but if they do, they'll demand it of Vice or Vox or somebody like that.
Yep.
They're not going to say, please, local TV station, do this. You know, and I'm sure your audience knows, the phrase cord cutters. Everybody hates the cable companies, and everybody, including myself, and everyone wants to disconnect their cable. And I actually know some significant cable executives who no longer subscribe to cable in their own homes because you can get great.
You can't share the information, or they'd have to kill you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You can get directly onto Netflix or one of the streaming programs that HBO and others offer. And among the younger demographics, millennials, people, the official definition of millennials probably stops at 35. I would say 15 to 40. They're cord nevers. They never signed up for cable in the first place. They have no interest in it now. Many of them don't even own a TV set. And so how a TV station would get that genie back in the bottle, even if they did exactly the kind of programming that younger viewers might want to see, no one has shown they can do that.
Yeah. So I want to shift and talk about sort of an area that you've really innovated in, which is, and what you call, in terms of sort of the core framework that you have for teaching a number of students, is reinventing television, reinventing television news. Talk a bit about that. I want to get your sense about more broadly how do we reinvent it, but what is it that you're trying to do with your students in looking at reinventing TV?
Well, I'm trying to do a couple of things. This is now, I think, the 10th year that I've run this course. Each year or every couple of years, we partner we embed ourselves inside a company that's trying to either invent itself, they're a startup in trying to get into the television or video news space, or they're a legacy company trying to reinvent themselves. This year we're embedded inside CNN, particularly Money and Politics. For the obvious reason, everybody thinks about money and we're coming to a presidential election cycle. And the idea is to show students at the Graduate School of Journalism, many of whom want to be entrepreneurs, what that means, what the challenges are, what the complexities are. The simple truth is all the low-hanging fruit in reinventing television news has been plucked. I say to students all the time, the people that run these companies, they're not stupid. Their jobs are on the line. They're smart people. They have much greater incentive than you. So you can't just walk around, blasé, saying, I think you should do this, I think you should do that. You're talking about people's careers. You're talking about investors, stockholders, the public, a lot of things. So I want to show the students the complexity of the media ecosystem that exists now, in which these companies are struggling to invent or reinvent themselves. If they existed in a bubble, wouldn't be so hard. But they exist in a ferociously competitive environment, competitive about technology, competitive about content, competitive about distribution, competitive about who's your audience, competitive about what does that audience want, how long will they be a user of your site or information or app or whatever it might be. So that's the main thrust of the course, is to make sure that students, through real world, actually confidential information we get from these companies, all my students agree to a confidentiality clause, that they have a sense of what managers wrestle with in trying to turn an old ship around or launch a new one. So if it were easier, everyone would do it.
Right, sure. Well, talk a little bit about CNN
Sure.
and maybe other places where you've been. How do they take advantage of having young, smart people come in? Do they take advantage of enough? Do they, in a sense, appreciate the engagement opportunity as opposed to, here's how I do it, kiddo?
Yeah, no, the outcome of the class is that I divide the students into small teams, or occasionally an individual has such a focus on one aspect of it, and they work throughout the semester on a potential solution to one part of what they perceive the company's challenges or problems or shortcomings might be. So at the moment, some of my students are working on specific news apps for CNN. Some are working on content verticals. Some are working on ways to attract very, very specific demographics to one or more of the platforms. So when we look at CNN, we look at it as a news organization, not just a television company. And
Right.
a lot of the management there now, most of whom arrived in the last year and a half or 2 years, are committed to a digital-first strategy, which is an exact reversal. CNN was always cable-first, subsequent distribution downstream. Now they want to do digital-first, and then transit some of that content onto the television screen. So the students are working on very, very specific projects that have gotten an endorsement, or at least an endorsement to proceed from CNN. So they've pitched ideas to various CNN managers, including Jeff Zucker, who's the CEO, and said, would you like it would it be helpful to you if the three of us, really smart graduate students with a commitment to this work and access to all the confidential information inside the company, if we came up with a beta test of something that you could then use. So the class functions a bit like a seminar, a bit like an incubator, a bit like a sort of skunk works for the company that we're embedded with.
And how do you and how do your students sort of, as you mentioned, what's happening at CNN, it'd be great if they could figure it out kind of in their own bubble or their own vacuum. They've got BuzzFeed and a million other folks kind of yapping at them. So how do the students, are they kind of already well immersed in that stuff from their day-to-day lives as millennials? Is there a part of it which is trying to learn and better understand outside of that, outside of the bubble?
Well, the students know what they like, but they only see, like everybody else in the public, a really small slice of the overall pie. So my job in leading them through this process is to say, let's first disaggregate what it is you like, just to take your example, about BuzzFeed or 1,000 other. What is it you like about Vice? What is it you like about this particular software, this particular app? Don't say, I like it. Let's really drill down. Yeah. Is it content? Is it format? Is it availability? Is it look and feel, design, user experience, engagement? What actually is it? So that's my first job. It's one thing to say, that's a cute baby. Most babies look pretty much the same at a certain stage, and you're not allowed to say anything except this baby's cute. But what exactly, if you think about it, is it that makes that baby cute? So that's the first thing they have to learn: how to disaggregate, and then how to extrapolate from what some other company is doing, which might be completely unrelated, in this case, to CNN. But still say, that company does something really interesting that would solve one part of CNN's challenge. Maybe we could import just that piece, user interface or look and feel or something like that, and transform one small part of CNN. So that's the first challenge, is to get them to say, okay, why is it? What are we actually looking at here? On a larger scale, the challenge for CNN and for other large legacy companies is every part of the system they depend on, that they've operated in for years, is now changing. So it's not just that competition is changing, right? It's not simply that, but literally, CNN doesn't own any cable companies. CNN is completely dependent on other unrelated companies to attach that wire to your house or the wireless system on which you get it and make the connection to the consumer. So without Verizon, without a dozen other companies, CNN's got nothing.
Yeah.
And these companies are not necessarily CNN's friend. They're looking out for their own commercial interests. So something as simple as getting the signal to the public in a way that's affordable to the public. Remember, CNN is dependent on cable companies. Most people hate cable companies. So it's not a great position to be in.
Yeah.
They don't like wireless companies much more. But there it is. CNN is stuck. So distribution is changing. Content is changing. Mobile has transformed everything. You name it. Every level of their business is changing dynamically all at the same time. So, how do you prioritize? If you're CNN, if you're Jeff Zucker, how do you prioritize where you're going to invest your dollars in changing the company fastest, right? And that's the really big challenge for.
Well, with that, David, I'm going to say thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us this evening on CITI Media Reporter. I'm Howard Homanoff. Good night.